Today I'm going to review for you The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. First off, I have to give a shout out to Adriel who book fairied me this. Thank you so much. I have really been wanting to read this. It's funny because this somehow just passed me by when it came out, but when Circe came out, I was really intrigued and I really thought I might read that, even though generally I just sort of avoid retellings and I don't even have a good reason for it. I just feel like I don't know, that story's been told, why do it again? But this book softened me up from that perspective, let me tell you. And I do think it's an interesting exercise, especially with what Madeline Miller is doing here in particular, because it's something that's very close to my heart. So let's go ahead and get into it. The Song of Achilles is a retelling of a particular part of the Iliad, focusing on Patroclus and Achilles. One just minor note about the pronunciation of this character's name. I realize that Patroclus isn't necessarily the most common pronunciation of the name, I guess, but that's the one I learned long ago. I can't unlearn it. I'm sorry. I tried to like even mentally say different things, but Achilles and Patroclus, that's how they've always been. So sorry. This retelling is from Patroclus's point of view, which makes for an interesting sort of story because, there were a lot of people who were like, oh, I cried so hard. You're going to cry. Prepare yourself. You're going to cry. I didn't cry. And I'm not always the easiest person to make cry in general, but I think part of it maybe was sort of diffused by the fact that I really love Greek and Roman mythology. Actually, I love all kinds of mythology, but when I was a kid, I was super duper into Greek and Roman mythology and read tons of stuff about it and kept that interest through my whole life. And as a young gay man, I definitely had heard about Patroclus and Achilles and their closeness and what that might mean to us today versus what it meant back then. So I did know what was going to happen. So maybe that was part of it. Because I do think Madeline Miller's writing is really gorgeous. It's the kind of writing I want for a tragedy because, it's a Greek tragedy. They like their tragedies. They're well known for them. To me, there should be sort of an operatic sort of sense to it. And I think Madeline Miller really brings that with her prose. And so when we come to sort of the tragic parts of this book, it's very beautifully told and executed. I think there's just some things inherent in the story that maybe held me back a little bit from getting to that level of emotion. That being said, it's so beautiful, and I really loved the book. I loved reading it. It zipped by to me. I found it a very involving read. One of the absolute best things that Miller does in this book is in her descriptions of the gods in general, but Thetis in particular. Every time Thetis showed up, again, I'm a big Greek and Roman mythology nerd. But every time Thetis showed up and just her presence and her power and the way she appeared, there's multiple times when various gods show up, and every time it's exciting to me. I find it, kind of special. Now, if you're looking for a really psychologically complex and nuanced take on a male-male relationship, I don't think you're really in the right neighborhood, to be honest, because Madeline Miller could have maybe gone that direction. But I think she has made a very conscientious decision to hew very closely to the original tale. And that creates some issues when you try to sort of expand things with these characters that I'll talk about in a second. But I appreciated that because it did make her job harder, but it felt more authentic. And to me, the power of this book, why I think it's so affecting, especially for some gay men, is because it does something that I have tried to do with my books as well, which is like In the Dark of the Grove. That's my horror thriller novel. I was reading a lot of Stephen King, and I was like, what would it be like to have a Stephen King novel where there were gay main characters and gay relationships centered? And that's why I wrote that book. The Master of Sheerhaven is kind of the same thing, but with gothic horror and gothic romance. In a similar way, I feel like Song of Achilles sort of places gay relationships within the context of mythology and history and creates a space for that where we can sort of celebrate and have this, tragic tale being told to us and we are seen and we are relevant. And the fact that this is pulled from actual history just makes it all the more special. And I do think that that's why this has struck such a deep chord for a lot of people. And certainly it struck that same chord with me. I think Miller does a really good job overall with the relationship between Achilles and Patroclus because she really does grapple with Achilles' sort of young godling status and the fact that his destiny, his fate, is so far removed from anything where a relationship can really thrive. So I think in order to make this make sense for her, that Patroclus is in essence a little bit better than a pet to Achilles. And that's not to lessen their love, but it's just, I think, sort of the part and parcel of the nature of Achilles, that the sort of attachment that he can form, there's a certain level of difference, maybe not in his heart or even something that he wants to really acknowledge, but it's there. And it's there early on. And certainly it's part of the reason why things get strained as the story goes on. So believe me, this should not be a pattern for love that I think anyone should follow, in much the same way that Romeo and Juliet is not a pattern for love that anyone should follow. They're not meant to be that. They are tragedies. And I think you have to approach them as such and see the characters through that lens. I do think it gets a little ropier when we get to the war. And I think some of that is due to Miller's adherence to the original story and to the timeline. Because Agamemnon's attempted siege of Troy lasts a very long time. We're talking 10 years. And for most of that time, the relationship between Achilles and Patroclus remains stagnant. It really isn't towards the end of it where things start to get dicey, where Achilles is really pushed to the furthest extent of his hubris. And it makes for a slightly frustrating figure in Patroclus because you want him to do something sooner. And he does do these little acts, like saving as much as the women as he can from Agamemnon's unwanted attentions. And I think that this is one of those situations where you have to look at it as a heightened operatic sort of text that is retelling something that is heightened and operatic. So realism kind of goes out the window because in a 10-year span, even if they weren't seeing each other that much, you just feel like it would have evolved a little more. And I do think that's something that Miller could have done, but the fact that she didn't do it here, it did kind of not really bother me. It did kind of stick in my craw, I guess we could say, but I don't think it was an insurmountable thing. And I kind of understood in the context of what else she was doing, why she took that approach. I did think the end of this was really affecting, really well done. And I totally understand why people have fallen head over heels for this book in a lot of ways. So even though it may have not had that emotional gut punch like it has had for some people, I still found it a really beautifully told tale, and I'm really glad I experienced it.